as the key clicked softly into the brass lock. I was squatting on the living room's hardwood floor, carefully adjusting the angle of my last spare key. This one-bedroom apartment in Lower Manhattan is the only asset my parents left me. It's located in an older but very well-maintained red brick building. To cope with next month's soaring property taxes and car loan payments, I had to list this guest bedroom on a rental website. The moment the door was pushed open, a cool autumn breeze swept in from New York. I straightened up, expecting to see some young Manhattan professional looking for a place to stay, or an art student carrying a sketchbook. But the person standing in the shadows of the doorway made my breath freeze for a moment. That was Victoria Sterling. She wore an impeccably tailored cashmere coat over a sophisticated gray silk shirt. Her long, golden hair neatly pulled back, revealing her long, slender, white neck. Her aloof features exuded an air of unapproachable nobility. That imposing aura of superiority I knew all too well. She was the CEO of Sterling Capital, and my direct superior at this financial consulting firm. Blake. Her voice was steady and cool, with an undeniable magnetism. It seems your side business is doing quite well. My fingers, gripping the keys, stiffened slightly, and my mind went blank for a moment. I opened my mouth, and it took me a while to find my voice. Director Victoria. What are you doing here? This apartment. The listing on the rental website is very clear. A 15-minute walk from Wall Street, with a private bathroom. 1 month's rent is deposit and 1 month's rent in advance, Victoria said, stepping in with remarkable ease, without even waiting for my permission. Her sharp gaze swept over the simple furnishings of the living room, her high heels clicking crisply on the wooden floor. What? My subordinate and husband. Don't you welcome me? Your tenant? Hearing the word husband pierced my heart, followed by a complex and indescribable bitterness. To outsiders, I, Blake Murphy, and the epitome of incredible luck. 3 months ago, as a low-level administrative compliance specialist, I inadvertently shielded Victoria from a major crisis during a high-level public relations operation. Then, amidst the complex situation at the board meeting, this aloof female CEO unexpectedly announced our marriage. At the time, countless colleagues looked at me with envy, mockery, and incomprehension, seeing me as a rich man's son-in-law who had risen to prominence. Only I knew that this marriage was strange from the very beginning. Although we were legally married, Victoria never publicly acknowledged our marital relationship, and she rarely even set foot in this apartment that belonged to me. We were husband and wife in name, but our lives were barely intersecting. She was more like an employer who was high and mighty, always looking down on me. Victoria, what's going on? I took a deep breath, closed the door, and tried to make my tone sound calm. If you need a place to stay, we have plenty of vacant townhouses on the Upper East Side or duplexes downtown. Why would you condescend to come to a small place like mine where the rent is only $2.500? Victoria took off her coat and casually draped it over the back of the sofa, then turned to look at me. Her eyes were devoid of warmth. The way she scrutinized her subordinates made me extremely uncomfortable. The Upper East Side is too conspicuous. Lately, my family has been keeping an eye on my private life. I need a completely quiet place where no one can bother me to handle the company's mergers and acquisitions for the next quarter. She walked to the living room window, pulled back the blinds, and looked at the dazzling New York night view outside. And this is the perfect place. Blake, don't look at me like that. We're a legally married couple, and it's only natural that I pay you rent. This isn't about the rent. I couldn't help but frown and take a step forward. Since we got married, you've always been distant and aloof towards me. Now you've suddenly moved into the apartment I rented out. Who are you trying to hide from? Or what are you plotting? Victoria sneered, turning her head to reveal a mocking expression on her flawlessly beautiful face. Scheming? Blake, you overestimate yourself. Marrying you is the greatest blessing of your life. If you can't even handle this small matter, or try to interfere in my private affairs, I don't mind reminding you who gave you your current position and salary. These words were like a resounding slap across my face. It was that condescending feeling again. At work, she used this tone to deal with competitors. In our marriage, she treated me, her so-called husband, with the same attitude. I clenched my fists so tightly my nails almost dug into my palms. In the past, I always chose to endure and yield because of this hard-won relationship, playing the role of her loyal dog and perfect subordinate. But now, looking at her utterly indifferent face, as if she treated me like a tool to be used at will, the resentment that had been suppressed in my heart for so long began to fester wildly. Okay, I loosened my clenched fist, a cold smile curving my lips. Since President Sterling is willing to condescend to be my tenant, I, as the landlord, naturally have no reason to kick him out. However, since it's a rental, we have to follow the rules. Victoria raised an eyebrow slightly, clearly not expecting me to speak to her in such a tone. She crossed her arms and looked at me with interest. Oh, what rules? I walked directly to the hallway dividing the master bedroom and guest bedroom, pointed to the room on the left. First, the guest bedroom is yours. The master bedroom is mine. You cannot enter my private space without my permission. Second, Work hours and personal time must be strictly separated. Here, I am the landlord. And you are the tenant. Don't bring your office pressure into my home. Third, I pause, then look directly into her eyes. Rent must be paid on time. No credit allowed. Even if you are my wife. The air in the living room seemed to freeze for a moment. Victoria's smile gradually faded, replaced by a hint of surprise and barely concealed anger. She probably never imagined that this man, who was usually so subservient to her at the company and always obeyed her every whim, would dare to set such a rule for her right in front of her. Blake, you've really got guts. Victoria narrowed her eyes, a dangerous aura emanating from her. There aren't many people on Wall Street who dare to talk to me like that. They're outside. This is my territory. I stared back at her without backing down, my tone so firm that it surprised even myself. If you're not comfortable with it, the gate is over there. You can still leave now. Just as we were at an impasse, Victoria's phone, which was in her coat pocket, suddenly vibrated. She gave me a cold look, then pulled out her phone and glanced at the screen. In that instant, I caught a fleeting glimpse of unusual panic in her eyes, an extremely rare emotion that almost never appeared in her. She quickly turned off the screen, shoved the phone back into her pocket, and her tone returned to its usual icy tone. Very good. Blake, I hope you can maintain this level of assertiveness when you face Richard at the company tomorrow. After saying that, she ignored me and walked straight into the narrow guest room in her high heels, slamming the door shut. As I heard the door close, I stood in the middle of the living room, my brow furrowing deeper and deeper. Richard Duncan, vice president of a well-known Wall Street venture capital firm and a long-term core partner of Sterling Capital, is also Victoria's childhood sweetheart and a potential business marriage partner. At the company, this arrogant second-generation chable finds ways to humiliate me almost daily, while Victoria always watches coldly, even subtly condoning it. Victoria's words just now were no casual remark. Richard is clearly plotting something against me at tomorrow's company executive meeting, and Victoria's sudden move into my apartment tonight is definitely related to the upcoming business conspiracy. I gave a cold laugh and went to the kitchen to pour myself a glass of ice water. Since you want to use me as a pawn to trample underfoot, let's see who ends up being the prey. I'm no longer that low-level employee who could only silently endure. Victoria, this game has only just begun. As the Manhattan morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows into Sterling Capital's spacious and bright conference room, the air was filled with the mingled aromas of premium freshly ground coffee beans and expensive cologne. On either side of the long walnut conference table sat executives from the company's various core departments. I sat in a corner at the far end, belonging to the compliance department, flipping through today's project debriefing report. Yet my fingertips could clearly feel the complex gazes cast upon me from all around. Office gossip never needs to be deliberately spread. Although my secret marriage to Victoria and I wasn't made public, rumors had already been circulating throughout the company. Almost everyone thought that I, a low-level administrator who got into the company by luck, was completely unworthy of the aloof and elegant female CEO. Especially Richard Duncan, who was sitting to Victoria's left, was leaning back in his leather chair with an undisguised contemptuous smile on his lips. Richard wore a custom-made Zegna suit today, and the limited-edition Patek Philippe on his wrist gleamed dazzlingly in the morning light streaming through the blinds. As a direct descendant of the Duncan family, he has always been domineering on Wall Street, and this venture capital project was entirely under his control. Victoria, the compliance and risk control data submitted last week seems to be riddled with flaws to me. Richard slowly twirled his Montblanc pen, not even glancing at me, but his voice was loud enough for half the conference room to hear. Some department heads are just sitting around doing nothing, drawing the company's salary, and can't even handle basic due diligence. If it weren't for the fact that some people know how to curry favor with them, they should have been fired long ago for this kind of inefficiency. A murmur of agreement immediately filled the meeting room. Several middle managers, who were usually fond of sycophancy, instantly revealed gloating expressions and glanced at me mockingly. In the past, upon hearing such public humiliation, I would probably have silently lowered my head, turned the page of the document, and swallowed all my grievances and anger, because I knew that Richard was an indispensable business ally in Victoria's eyes, while I was merely an insignificant appendage. But today, when Victoria's cold face from last night, and the fleeting, frantic encrypted text message on her phone, resurfaced in my mind, a string in my heart snapped completely. I didn't lower my head. Instead, I slowly closed the folder in my hands, making a remarkably clear, soft sound. I looked up, my gaze meeting Victoria's as she sat in the head seat. She was looking down at her tablet, her expression as calm as a deep pool, as if Richard's public mockery of me had nothing to do with her. This kind of indifferent indulgence is the most unfathomable and deadly blade. Vice President Richard, I began, my voice not loud, but unusually clear in the quiet conference room. If I remember correctly, the compliance data you mentioned, riddled with flaws, was sent directly from your venture capital department before 3 p.m. last Friday, and according to Article 4 of the company's compliance code, The initial entry of all basic due diligence data is to be done by your venture capital team's interns. Richard's smile froze slightly. He turned his head, a sinister glint in his eyes. Blake, are you trying to shirk responsibility? You're in the compliance department. The data passed through your hands, so if there's a problem, it's your dereliction of duty. Negligence? I sneered, pulling out a printed copy of an email backup and system log from my briefcase. Vice President Richard, this is the original data verification sheet your venture capital department sent me last Friday at 3:15 p.m. It has the electronic signature of your team leader. The email clearly states, the data has been verified by the venture capital department and is correct. As the compliance auditor, I discovered 3 instances of inflated valuations of key assets within 10 minutes of receiving it, and sent a written warning letter to your email address through the internal system. I stood up, gently slammed the document on the table, and scanned the room. Vice President Richard, who, after receiving the warning letter, not only failed to make any changes but also directly demanded that our compliance department shut up and proceed with the original plan. Should I project the recording of that call or screenshot of the email onto the big screen so that all the senior executives present can judge for themselves? The air in the conference room instantly plummeted to freezing point. The executives who had initially been expecting a laugh all paled, their whispers abruptly ceasing. Richard's face went from white to red, then from red to ashen, the veins on his forehead throbbing. He slammed his fist on the table, stood up abruptly, and pointed at my nose, roaring, Blake, who do you think you are, daring to spout such nonsense? Believe me, I can make sure you're completely finished in this industry with just one word. On Wall Street. Since when has it become the turn of an external partner to decide the fate of an employee at Sterling Capital? I met his gaze without flinching, my tone as cold and hard as iron. Richard, this is Sterling Capital, not the private property of your Duncan family. If you can't even do basic document verification properly, or if you're trying to use business to cover up some non-compliant operations, then the one who should be fired isn't me. You. Richard trembled with rage, turning to Victoria at the head of the table, and said through gritted teeth, Victoria, look at your good employee. He's openly provoking our partner. If you don't fire him immediately and cancel our future cooperation, Duncan Capital will immediately withdraw its $200 million investment. This move, cutting off their lifeline, was extremely ruthless. The $200 million in funding was crucial for the multi-billion-dollar acquisition that Sterling Capital was currently pursuing. Almost everyone's attention was focused on Victoria, waiting for this iron-fisted female CEO to unleash her fury and fire me, this arrogant low-level son-in-law. To appease the partner's anger, Victoria finally slowly raised her head. Her icy blue eyes looked at me quietly, without anger or panic, only a profound and unfathomable depth. I met her gaze, without flinching. I knew this was a life-or-death struggle between my husband and me. If she chose to compromise with Richard and abandon me, then I could finally see this woman's true colors and shatter my last shred of illusion. The conference room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Richard stood with his arms crossed, his face once again displaying that confident, arrogant smile, as if to say, who do you think you are? Trying to fight me? Victoria parted her red lips slightly, about to speak, when her phone on the table vibrated again. This time, she didn't immediately suppress it. Instead, she frowned slightly, glancing at the sender's name that popped up on the screen out of the corner of her eye. In that instant, I keenly caught a fleeting, almost imperceptible look of panic and apprehension in her eyes. It was definitely not pressure from Richard, but rather some terrifying presence from a higher level. Victoria took a deep breath, looked away from her phone screen and focused her gaze back on Richard, her tone as cold as ice crystals in the dead of winter. Richard, Victoria said slowly, her voice not loud, but carrying an undeniable authority. When did it become your place to interfere with Sterling Capital's internal compliance processes? The issues Blake pointed out are not only correct, but extremely accurate. If even basic financial fraud dares to occur openly in my company, then this $200 million cooperation is not worth discussing. This statement caused an uproar in the audience. Richard's smile froze instantly, and he stood there as if struck by lightning, exclaiming, Victoria, are you crazy? You're going to turn against me for a low-level administrative position? Do you know what you're doing? I know exactly what I'm doing. Victoria stood up, looking down at Richard, whose face was ashen. This concludes today's senior management meeting. Vice President Richard, take your men and leave the Sterling Capital building immediately. After saying that, she didn't look at Richard again, picked up her handbag, and walked out of the conference room in her high heels without looking back. I stood there, looking at Richard's ugly face, filled with anger and helplessness, and sneered inwardly. They won the first round, but I know very well that the reason Victoria rejected Richard's request in public was not because she had any affection for me as a wife, but because that mysterious message had touched her bottom line of greater interests. I silently put away the documents, turned around, and walked out of the conference room. At the corner of the corridor, I took out my phone and looked at the text message I had just received from an unknown encrypted channel. Mr. Black, the game on Wall Street is set, and Mr. Collin is ready to open it for you at any time. As night fell, the chilly autumn rain in Manhattan pattered against the floor-to-ceiling windows. I sat on the living room sofa, a warm glass of bourbon in my hand, my gaze fixed on the tablet computer Victoria had left behind on the coffee table. Ever since I publicly humiliated Richard in the company conference room earlier that day, leaving the venture capital VP in a sorry state, the atmosphere within the company had been incredibly tense. Everyone thought I would face extremely severe private punishment from Victoria. Even the seasoned veterans in the compliance department had begun to deliberately distance themselves from me, fearing they would be implicated by this arrogant son-in-law. However, Victoria didn't go back to her apartment after get-off work. Instead, she sent me a short text message. I have a business engagement tonight. Don't wait for me. I've heard this excuse countless times over the past 3 months. Before, whenever she didn't come home late at night, I'd foolishly keep the soup warm, worrying that she'd drunk too much at a business dinner, and even tossing and turning, filled with self-doubt, because of the occasional flirtatious messages from Richard flashing on her phone. Looking back now, I realize how incredibly stupid I was. Those weren't business dinners. She was simply conspiring with Richard and his cronies to transfer more assets. Just as I was staring coldly at my phone screen, the silence of the living room was broken by the extremely faint sound of a door lock turning. I paused for a moment, then looked up. The motion sensor light in the entryway turned on, and Victoria's tall figure appeared in the doorway. She took off her expensive cashmere coat and tossed it casually onto the sofa. Her once impeccably styled blonde hair now appeared somewhat disheveled, and her fair cheeks were flushed with an unnatural blush. The air was filled with the faint scent of French perfume and the rich aroma of fine red wine. She drank quite a lot of alcohol. Victoria staggered to the sofa and slumped into the armchair. Her eyes were closed, her long fingers rubbing her temples, her face etched with exhaustion. Normally, seeing her like this, I would probably immediately put down my glass, go to the kitchen to make her some hangover tea, and ask her with concern if she was tired. But this time, I just sat there quietly, without even changing my posture, and coldly watched her. Blake, why aren't you coming over? Victoria noticed my indifference. She slowly opened her eyes, her icy blue pupils filled with a hazy and agitated feeling fueled by alcohol. Who are you trying to impress with that judge's attitude? You talked back to Richard in the conference room during the day. Do you think you're so tough? I was just doing my job as the head of compliance. I took a sip of whiskey, my tone flat and emotionless. But Director Victoria, coming home late at night smelling of another man's cologne, and then lecturing me, her legal husband? Doesn't she find that a bit ridiculous? Victoria's expression changed slightly, her eyes instantly clearing. She sat up straight, staring coldly at me. What do you mean by that? Blake, are you doubting me? Suspicion? I scoffed, slamming my glass down on the coffee table with a sharp clang. Victoria, we've been married for 3 months, while you're using me as a shield, as a tool to stop your family's pressure to get married. Do you think I'm out of my mind, unable to see through your shady affair with Richard? The bill from your private room at the Broadway Club accidentally ended up in the company finance department last month, and I had to personally balance it for you. Do you want me to print out the receipts in Richard's name and post them on the company bulletin board? With a loud bang, Victoria's face turned deathly pale in an instant. She stood up abruptly, her high heels clicking on the carpet, her voice sharp with anger. Blake, are you crazy? You're investigating me? How could I not investigate you? How could I possibly justify this meticulously planned marriage? I slowly stood up, the imposing height causing Victoria to instinctively take a half step back. I approached her step by step, the chill in my eyes instilling a strange sense of panic in her. Back then, to fight for the inheritance of sterling capital, you needed a puppet husband with no background, easy to manipulate, and absolutely obedient to shut the board up. You chose me, using a pitiful career advancement as bait to lure me into this marriage, and behind the scenes, you colluded with that good-for-nothing Richard, not only conspiring to transfer family assets, but also planning to kick me, this incompetent son-in-law, out completely after the merger and acquisition deal is completed next quarter. Right. Victoria's lips trembled slightly as she stared intently at me, her eyes filled with disbelief and shock. She probably never dreamed that Blake, who was usually so meek and submissive in front of her, had already figured out all her tricks. You, how much do you know? Victoria's voice trembled slightly, and her aura as a high and mighty female CEO completely collapsed at this moment. I know far more than you think. I looked at her coldly, took the tablet out of my pocket, and threw it onto the sofa. This device is a company-issued dual-use machine, but you usually keep it in a safe with a combination lock in your study. You thought you were safe just because you changed to a high-security lock? Unfortunately, you set the password to your mother's birthday, and you used those numbers in your public financial statement 3 years ago. Victoria stared at the tablet, her face ashen. She finally realized that the man before her was no longer the lowly employee she could manipulate at will. Just then, Victoria's phone, which was in her coat pocket, suddenly started vibrating wildly. The screen flickered in the dim living room, displaying Richard's name. Victoria instinctively reached for her phone, but I snatched it away before she could. Blake, give me back my phone! Victoria screamed and lunged at him, trying to snatch it away. I deftly sidestepped her, pressed the answer button right in front of her, and put it on speakerphone. Richard's impatient and arrogant voice immediately came through the phone. Victoria! What's wrong with you? That bastard Blake made me lose face at the board meeting today. You need to find a way to fire him right now. And while you're at it, plug the final loophole in that core M&A agreement. Otherwise, once my dad finds out the money is being diverted, none of us will get away with this. A deathly silence fell over the living room. Richard was still hurling curses on the other end of the phone, while Victoria stood frozen, her face turning from white to pale, her whole body trembling violently with extreme anger and embarrassment. Holding my phone, I walked up to Victoria, looked down at her, and said into the microphone, word by word, Vice President Richard, listen carefully. Who do you want to fire? And whose assets do you want to transfer to which overseas account? I've already sent this recording to Sterling Capital's Board of Directors. Oversight Committee. I wish you good luck at tomorrow's hearing. After saying that, I hung up the phone and tossed it back onto the sofa. Richard's furious roar on the other end of the phone abruptly stopped. Victoria's legs went weak, and she almost collapsed onto the sofa. She looked up, and her once extremely arrogant eyes were now filled with tears. Her voice carried a hint of despair. Blake, do you know that what you're doing will destroy the entire Sterling Capital? The Duncan family behind Richard will use all their resources to kill you. Kill me? I sneered, turned around, and walked to the window, looking at the cold, rain-washed New York street scene outside. Victoria, from the moment you chose to use me as a pawn and betray this marriage, we had no way out. What are the Duncan family? What is Sterling Capital? No sooner had I finished speaking than my personal cell phone, which was on the coffee table, suddenly rang. It was a private ringtone from an encrypted overseas channel. Only one person on the entire Wall Street would use this channel to contact me. I picked up my phone and pressed the answer button. A deep, hoarse voice, yet one that exuded absolute control, came from the other end. Mr. Black, the winds of change have shifted on Wall Street. Mr. Colin Howard has just signed an agreement to acquire 15% of Sterling Capital's shares. From now on, you are the true mastermind behind this company. I hung up the phone, turned to look at Victoria, whose face was deathly pale, and a cold, cruel smile curled at the corner of my lips. The game has only just begun. The early morning air in New York carried the crispness characteristic of early winter, and Charging Bull Plaza on Wall Street was already filled with hurried financial professionals. I sat in a booth at an upscale, private cafe in Lower Manhattan, a cup of Americano in my hand, calmly watching the bustling crowds outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. On the table lay a confirmation letter of equity transfer, recently delivered by a top law firm. It prominently displayed Colin Howard's name, along with the 15% of core voting shares belonging to Sterling Capital. To the outside world, Colin's name represents one of Wall Street's most secretive and terrifying financial tycoons. He always operated alone, rarely appearing in public. Yet he consistently managed to devour countless established financial giants with precise attacks at crucial moments. What most people don't know is that 5 years ago, Colin's father nearly went bankrupt in a brutal, bloodless business battle. It was my late father who provided a life-saving compliance loophole audit report at the critical moment, saving their family from annihilation. Colin always remembered this kindness. When he learned that I had been caught up in a marriage scam orchestrated by Sterling Capital and the Duncan family, and had even been nearly discarded as a pawn, this Wall Street godfather did not hesitate to extend an olive branch to me. Mr. Black, it seems last night was not peaceful. A deep and magnetic voice sounded in my ear. I looked up and saw a middle-aged Asian man with graying hair but sharp, eagle-like eyes, wearing a meticulously tailored black bespoke suit, walking towards me. He was Mr. Chin, Colin's chief personal assistant, and Colin's authorized representative in the American capital markets. Mr. Chin pulled out a chair and sat down opposite me, casually pushing a thick black file folder in front of me. Mr. Chin, it's faster than I expected. I snapped out of my thoughts, picked up the file folder, and glanced at it. Inside, there was not only the escrow agreement for the 15% stake that Colin had just transferred to me, but also a detailed investigation report on Richard Duncan's family's venture capital fund's recent alleged money laundering and insider trading. Mr. Chin took a sip of his coffee and smiled slightly. Mr. Collins said that Mr. Black is not only capable, but also has a clear mind. Ms. Victoria and the Duncan family think they have everything under control, but they don't realize that in the face of a true financial behemoth, they are nothing but clowns. This material is enough to make Richard suffer at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. As for Victoria, she will soon understand what fate awaits her within the family after losing the support of Sterling Capital's major shareholders. I closed the file folder and carefully placed it into my briefcase, my eyes remaining completely calm. Thank you for your trust, Mr. Colin. I will close this game at my own pace. After saying goodbye to Mr. Chin, I drove back to the Sterling Capital headquarters building alone. As soon as I reached the compliance department entrance, I noticed that the office atmosphere was completely different from usual. My colleagues, who typically ignored me and even mocked me, were now huddled together outside the break room, heads bowed, whispering amongst themselves. When they saw me enter, they scattered like birds, their eyes filled with shock, awe, and a hint of inexplicable fear. I ignored these fence-sitters and went straight to my desk. As soon as I turned on my computer, dozens of urgent emails popped up in my intranet inbox. The most prominent one was from the company's board secretariat. In light of several recent major compliance loopholes and asset transfers, the board has decided to hold an emergency closed-door hearing tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. All core executives and relevant responsible persons must attend. Almost at the same time, my office landline started ringing incessantly. I stared coldly at the constantly flashing caller ID and immediately pressed the speakerphone button. Victoria's slightly hurried and hoarse voice came through the receiver. "Blake, where are you? Come to my office right now." "Director Victoria, please be mindful of your address during working hours." I leaned back in my leather chair, my tone calm and collected. "If you have a routine report on company compliance matters, please schedule an appointment with me according to company procedures. If it's a personal matter, we can discuss it tonight when we get back to that apartment, provided you're in the mood." A brief silence fell on the other end of the phone. Victoria clearly hadn't expected me to speak to her in such a condescending tone. In the past, whenever she used such a commanding tone, I would always drop everything and rush to her office. Now, the roles were completely reversed. "Blake, what exactly did you do to the board?" Victoria's voice was filled with barely suppressed anger and a hint of panic. "This morning, before the market opened, the company's stock was inexplicably dumped by a large amount of unexplained capital, and then the chairman of the board suddenly issued an emergency hearing notice. Richard is now scrambling to pull strings. But the Duncan family is also in trouble. Was all of this your doing? I'm just a lowly compliance manager." "Victoria, you overestimate me," I chuckled, my tone dripping with sarcasm. "How could I possibly have the power to manipulate the capital markets on Wall Street? As for you, as the CEO of Sterling Capital, instead of questioning me here, you should be thinking about how you're going to explain to the board tomorrow how you and Richard are secretly transferring company assets and suspected of financial fraud." "You," Victoria trembled with anger. "Blake, don't forget we're still legally married. Don't you understand the principle of shared prosperity and shared ruin? If Sterling Capital collapses, what kind of end do you think you'll be in?" Hearing the words husband and wife only made me feel incredibly ironic. "Husband and wife?" I interrupted her coldly. "Victoria, when you and Richard were using me as a pawn in that high-class club, scheming to kick me out, did you ever think about us being husband and wife? When you trampled my dignity underfoot with your indifference and arrogance, did you ever think about us being husband and wife?" The air in the office seemed to drop to freezing point, and Victoria's breathing became noticeably rapid on the other end of the phone. She opened her mouth, as if wanting to explain something, but faced with the undeniable facts, any weak excuses seemed utterly ridiculous. "See you at the board hearing tomorrow morning at 10 a.m., President Victoria." I didn't give her a chance to continue speaking and hung up the phone directly. Listening to the busy tone coming from the receiver, I leaned back in my chair and turned to look out the window at the bustling Manhattan cityscape. Sunlight streamed onto the distant skyscrapers, reflecting a dazzling light. This is just the first step in revenge. Tomorrow, when Victoria discovers at the board meeting that everything she has painstakingly built has been completely controlled by me, the low-class scoundrel in her eyes, her once arrogant and domineering mask will shatter into pieces. A light autumn rain fell in lower Manhattan early in the morning, and a gray fog shrouded the towering skyscrapers. Inside the boardroom on the top floor of Sterling Capital's headquarters, the atmosphere was oppressively tense. The long walnut conference table was filled with the company's core directors and senior partners. The air was thick with the aroma of fine cigars and bitter black coffee, and everyone was whispering amongst themselves, discussing the unexpected, closed-door hearing. Victoria, seated to the right of the head of the table, was pale, although she was still wearing her impeccably tailored gray business suit, and her blonde hair was meticulously combed. The barely concealed panic and exhaustion in her eyes betrayed her inner anxiety. Just last night, the Duncan family's venture capital fund was suddenly raided by federal securities regulators, and Richard, as the principal responsible person, has been barred from leaving the country. Meanwhile, Victoria's core acquisition project, painstakingly developed over many years, faces complete collapse due to a broken funding chain and compliance loopholes. When I pushed open the heavy double solid wood doors of the conference room, all eyes immediately turned to me. For the past 3 months, as the most low-profile administrator in the compliance department, I was practically the least noticeable person here. But today, I walked steadily into this room that will determine the fate of the company, wearing a brand new, custom-made dark blue suit and carrying a thick file folder. "Blake, you're late." Victoria raised her head with forced composure. trying to suppress me with her condescending CEO tone. Today is a court compliance hearing for a large corporation. Not a place where an ordinary administrative employee like you can be late and act recklessly. I ignored her sarcastic remarks and walked straight to the end of the conference table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. I slowly opened the file folder, calmly scanning the assembled directors before finally settling my gaze on the gray-haired chairman of the board, who sat in the center. Mr. Chairman, fellow directors, good morning. My voice wasn't loud, but it was exceptionally clear and powerful in the quiet conference room. Before the hearing officially begins, as the head of compliance at Sterling Capital, I have a final investigation report on several recent major asset transfers and financial frauds within the company, which I need to give you a detailed report on. Upon hearing this, Victoria's expression instantly changed. She slammed her hand on the table and stood up abruptly, her delicate face contorted with incredulous anger. Blake, what nonsense are you spouting? Do you know what you're doing? Shut up and get out of the conference room right now. Director Victoria, please watch your temper. The chairman of the board, sitting in the chairperson's seat, frowned, raised his hand to lower the pressure, and looked at me with an authoritative gaze. Blake, since you are the head of the compliance department, you have the right to present the facts at the board meeting. Show me your evidence. If it's just baseless slander, you should know the consequences. I never make baseless statements. I smiled slightly and gently pushed the first document to the center of the table. The financial loophole comparison table, prepared overnight by the top audit team arranged by Mr. Chin, immediately caught the eyes of all the directors. Please take a look, everyone. These are 3 huge sums of money that were approved by Director Victoria and flowed directly to offshore accounts in the past 6 months. Nominally, they were used for the expansion and research of overseas projects, but after in-depth tracking by the compliance department, the final recipient was a shell company called Duncan Capital, and the actual controller of this company is Richard Duncan. A collective gasp filled the conference room. Several veteran directors, their faces ashen, passed the document around. Every transaction and every electronic signature on it was irrefutable evidence, leaving no room for argument. This is forged. This is slander. Victoria's voice began to tremble. She strode to the table, stared intently at the document, turned around and hysterically yelled at me. Blake, you treacherous ingrate. To get back at me for my strict demands, you've conspired with outsiders to fabricate false evidence to frame me. Board members, don't believe him. He's just a low-level good-for-nothing who got into the company through connections. Looking at her utterly distraught face, where she even went so far as to publicly smear others, I felt nothing but utter irony. The once aloof and arrogant female CEO who took my feelings and fate for granted has finally tasted the bitterness of falling from grace. Framed? I sneered, slowly stood up, and looked down at her. Victoria, now that things have come to this, are you still going to keep pretending? Do you need me to play the recording of you and Richard conspiring to transfer assets in your private apartment on the Upper East Side, as well as your shady chat logs, right on the big screen? Upon hearing the words private apartment, Victoria froze on the spot as if struck by lightning. Her lips drained of color, and her whole body trembled violently. She couldn't understand how her deeply hidden secret could have been discovered so thoroughly by me, her loyal husband who could never cause any trouble in her eyes. Enough! The chairman of the board, sitting in the center, slammed his fist on the table, his face so dark it could drip water. Victoria, the company entrusted you with the important task of CEO because we trust your abilities, not because we want you to turn Sterling Capital into a tool for you and the Richard family to line your own pockets. You have disappointed me greatly. Mr. Chairman, let me explain. This is all. Victoria frantically tried to reach out and grab the chairman's arm, but he coldly brushed her away. No need to explain. When the federal securities regulators and the Department of Justice come looking for you, you can explain yourself in court. The chairman turned his head coldly to look at me standing to the side, a hint of admiration flashing in his eyes. Mr. Black, in view of your outstanding abilities and loyal compliance to the company during this crisis, the board of directors has unanimously passed an emergency interim vote to remove Victoria Sterling from all executive positions. At this point, the chairman paused, then solemnly announced the next decision. Furthermore, given that Mr. Colin Howard has just completed the acquisition of 15% of the company's core shares and appointed a fully authorized agent, effective immediately, Mr. Blake Murphy will officially assume the position of the new executive director and acting president of Sterling Capital. Boom! The moment those words were spoken, the entire conference room erupted in cheers. Those executives who had initially gloated and watched with indifference all stood up from their seats, their faces filled with shock and disbelief. They never dreamed that Blake, yesterday a low-level administrator and a laughingstock, would today have undergone a dramatic role reversal, parachuting in as the top leader of this long-established financial giant. Victoria's legs gave way, and she slumped completely into the leather chair behind her. She stared blankly at me, her eyes unfocused, her lips trembling as she murmured, You knew all along. Why did you approach me? Why did you marry me? I slowly walked up to her, looking down at this once arrogant woman, my tone calm and undisturbed. Victoria, all of this is just the interest you should have paid when you chose to use me as a pawn. I leaned down slightly and whispered in her ear in a voice only the two of us could hear. This game is only just beginning to reach its climax. The chilly autumn winds and drizzle in lower Manhattan cast a somber glow over Wall Street. I sat in the CEO's office on the top floor of Sterling Capital, an office that originally belonged to Victoria. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the sky was overcast, while inside, the once spotless, imposing desk, exuding absolute power and cold luxury, was now piled high with asset restructuring and equity liquidation documents that required my signature. Since my decisive takeover of Sterling Capital at yesterday's closed-door board hearing, the entire Wall Street financial world has felt like it's experienced an earthquake of magnitude 8. The Duncan family's venture capital funds have been completely frozen by federal securities regulators due to allegations of serious financial defaults and money laundering, and Richard Duncan, once high and mighty and invincible, now doesn't even dare to show his face, reportedly busy searching for top criminal defense lawyers to try and escape imprisonment. As for Victoria, the woman who once treated me like a pawn to be manipulated at will and who betrayed me recklessly in our marriage, after losing all her executive duties and family protection, she has been directly ordered to suspend her duties by the elders within the Sterling family and to hand over control of all her core assets. President Black. This is the latest quarterly list of assets recovered from offshore accounts. Mr. Collins' legal team has completed its review and is ready to proceed with the final legal action at any time. The senior deputy director of the compliance department walked in. This old hand, who used to be obedient to Victoria and even gave me a hard time in private, now stood in front of my desk, his back bent at almost a 90-degree angle, a fine layer of sweat on his forehead, and his voice trembling with undisguised awe. Without even looking up, I simply flipped through the reports in my hand and said calmly, "Put it here. Also, notify the legal department that every single transaction concerning Richard and Victoria's transfer of company assets using their positions over the past 6 months should be handed over directly to the federal prosecutor's office. Without exception. Understood, President Blake." "I'll do it right away," the deputy manager replied repeatedly, wiping away cold sweat as he quickly retreated from the office as if fleeing, gently closing the heavy solid wood door behind him. Silence returned to the office. I leaned back in my large, comfortable leather executive chair, my gaze falling on the personal tablet that Victoria had once owned, which sat on the coffee table. The screen was completely black, but I knew perfectly well that just a few hours earlier, my assistant had presented me with news that was both unexpected and perfectly logical. Victoria has arrived. She didn't make an appointment, nor did she use the proper visitor entrance. Instead, she waited for me alone in the underground parking lot downstairs for 2 whole hours. Like a lost dog, I didn't immediately have her evicted, nor did I rush to see her. Sometimes, waiting and despair are the best punishments for someone who was once extremely arrogant. I slowly finished processing the last few documents related to asset liquidation, closed my pen, picked up my custom-made suit jacket from the back of my chair, put it on, and strode out of the office. When I arrived at the dark corner of Sterling Capital's underground parking lot in the private elevator, I immediately spotted the once radiant, icy female CEO. Victoria stood alone on the wet concrete. She was still wearing the cashmere coat she had worn to the upscale club a few days ago, but now the hem was stained with mud, and her once impeccably styled blonde hair was now disheveled and plastered to her pale cheeks. Her exquisite makeup was now a mess, washed away by tears and rain, and her once arrogant and cold icy blue eyes were now filled with endless despair, panic, and an almost pleading emptiness. When she heard the elevator doors open, she looked up abruptly and saw me calmly walking out. Her legs went slightly weak, and she almost staggered as she walked quickly toward me. "Blake, you've finally agreed to see me." Victoria's voice was terribly hoarse, completely lacking the cool and arrogant demeanor she usually displayed as the company's CEO. She tried to reach out and grab my suit sleeve, just as she had done countless times before, but when her fingertips were about to touch me, she froze in midair, as if suddenly realizing that a complete reversal had occurred between us. I looked down at her, my hands in my suit trouser pockets, my eyes showing no anger or mockery, only a chilling indifference. "Director Victoria." "No, I should call you Ms. Victoria now," I said calmly, my voice echoing in the empty, cold parking lot. "Instead of reflecting on your compliance issues at home during work hours, you've come here to confront me, the company's executive director. If word gets out, it won't do the Sterling family's remaining reputation any good." Hearing me address her in such an extremely cold and businesslike tone, Victoria's tears instantly welled up. She no longer cared about dignity or propriety. Her voice trembled, tinged with a sob. "Blake, I beg you, I know I've wronged you. I was blind to have treated that good-for-nothing Richard like a treasure, and you like a pawn I could use at will. But we're married. Legally we're husband and wife." Husband and wife? Upon hearing these 2 words, I couldn't help but let out a sarcastic chuckle. "Victoria, When you were embracing Richard in that private club on Broadway, plotting how to kick me, your so-called legal husband, out of the company. Did you ever think about the fact that we were husband and wife? When you joined forces with Richard to publicly humiliate me at the board meeting, as if you wanted to crush me into the mud, did you ever think about the fact that we were husband and wife? I approached her step by step, and the overwhelming sense of pressure made Victoria retreat in fear, until her back slammed heavily against the cold concrete pillar. Victoria's lips trembled, her face ashen. I was just trying to secure the family inheritance. The Duncan family behind Richard could provide me with financial support. And I thought you would always listen to me and never betray me. I didn't know Colin would help you. I really didn't know. There's a lot you don't know. I interrupted her coldly. Victoria, you've never really understood me. Just like you never knew that what you call the chance promotion was actually a perfect compliance and risk control report that I deliberately submitted to create an image of you as extremely capable in front of the board. You thought you had chosen me as your obedient puppet. But in reality, from the day you decided to extend an olive branch to me, you had already walked into a trap that I, Blake, had meticulously set up. With a deafening roar, Victoria was struck dumb. Her eyes widened, staring intently at me, her gaze filled with utter shock and disbelief. Only now did she fully awaken to the fact that, from beginning to end, she had been the one kept in the dark, manipulated like a puppet. You're so cunning. Victoria gave a bitter laugh, tears streaming down her dirty face. Blake, you've won. Sterling Capital is gone. My reputation is gone. And I've even been stripped of my right to be the family heir. What do you want? I'll do anything if you just drop the lawsuit against me. If you just forgive me. I beg you. Watching her kneel on the wet cement ground, the once arrogant and aloof female CEO now humbled to the ground, I felt no pleasure whatsoever, only a sense of relief after a great revenge had been achieved. I bent down slightly, looking down at her, and took a pre-prepared document from my briefcase, gently tossing it into the puddle in front of her. Forgive you? Victoria, those 3 words just disgust me when you say them, I said coldly. This is a divorce agreement where you leave with nothing, plus a legal statement voluntarily relinquishing all inheritance rights to Sterling Capital. Sign it, get out of Manhattan, and never let me see you again. Victoria stared at the document lying in the puddle at her feet, her whole body trembling violently. She slowly reached out her hands, wanting to pick it up, but ultimately collapsed helplessly to the ground, her desperate cries echoing in the empty underground parking lot. I didn't look at her again, turned around, opened the door of the Rolls-Royce, and got in. The car slowly started moving, heading towards the distant night. The autumn drizzle in lower Manhattan finally stopped before dawn, and a faint tinge of white appeared on the horizon. I stood on the private observation deck at Sterling Capital, a cup of warm black coffee in my hand, overlooking Wall Street, which was gradually returning to its bustling state. In the distance, Charging Bull Plaza was teeming with people. A new day had arrived as scheduled, but for the entire American financial world, the landscape had undergone a complete and radical reshuffling. Yesterday evening, after handing Victoria the divorce papers and legal statement relinquishing her inheritance rights in the underground parking lot, she finally signed her name in despair and collapse. Having lost the protection of the Sterling family and burdened with federal charges of massive asset transfers and financial fraud, this once aloof and arrogant businesswoman fled Manhattan in a sorry state overnight, her fortunes shattered. Richard Duncan, her accomplice, was formally arrested under the swift action of federal securities regulators and prosecutors. To protect themselves, the Duncan family had no choice but to make a drastic decision, publicly severing all ties with Richard. The once powerful heir to a wealthy family now awaits a long trial in a cold detention center. Good morning, President Black. A soft footstep sounded behind me, and the newly appointed head of the compliance department walked over quickly, holding the latest market news report. His tone was filled with undisguised respect and admiration. This is the front page of the Wall Street Journal this morning, about our asset restructuring and equity merger completed yesterday. The media has given it extremely high praise. In addition, Mr. Colin's personal assistant just sent a congratulatory telegram, inviting you to dinner tonight at the Manhattan Club to celebrate the official listing of the new group. I took the morning paper, and the headline on the front page was striking, accompanied by a picture of me standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking Wall Street. The low-level administrator who was once at the beck and call of the company, even bearing the shameful label of gold digger, has now been officially crowned as the powerful figure in Sterling Capital and even the entire Wall Street financial circle. Tell Mr. Colin that I will be at the dinner tonight on time. I casually placed the newspaper on the table and calmly instructed. In addition, regarding the core assets that originally belonged to Victoria and Richard, they should be incorporated into the new charitable trust fund and compliance risk reserve according to the established plan. Not a single penny should be left. Understood. I'll arrange for the legal team to take care of it immediately. The deputy manager nodded repeatedly and then left the office with utmost respect. Silence returned to the office. I turned around, my gaze falling on the empty photo frame in the corner of my desk, the one that had once belonged to Victoria. Now completely emptied. The past 3 months of forbearance, humiliation, and being manipulated as a pawn felt like an incredibly long and absurd nightmare. And now, the dream was over. With absolute wisdom and top-tier financial power, I not only crushed those arrogant traitors who treated dignity like dirt into the mud, but also reclaimed all the glory that belonged to me. At 9 a.m., Sterling Capital held its first expanded meeting of all senior executives since the formation of its new board of directors. When I pushed open the heavy solid wood door, the previously noisy conference room fell silent instantly. Dozens of core executives, heads of various business units, and senior partners, who were seated on either side of the long walnut conference table, all stood up in unison. The contempt, skepticism, or indifference in their eyes were gone, replaced by absolute awe, submission, and cautious obsequiousness. I didn't say anything, but walked steadily to the head seat and sat down very naturally. "Sit down," I said calmly, my voice not loud, but carrying an undeniable and absolute sense of control. Everyone then cautiously sat down again, even deliberately softening their breathing. A veteran director sitting at the lower end wiped the cold sweat from his brow and was the first to report. "President Black, the liquidation of all offshore projects and non-compliant assets left over from last quarter has been completed. The new group's Articles of Association and Equity Structure Adjustment Plan have been filed with the Federal Compliance Agency, and can be publicly released to the global capital market at any time." "Very good." I nodded, my gaze sweeping over everyone present, and slowly said, "Sterling Capital has experienced some unnecessary turmoil and internal corruption in the past. But that's all in the past. From today onward, the company's core values are just 2 words: compliance and absolute efficiency. I don't want to hear any more rumors about factionalism, bribery, or treating the company as a private playground. If anyone dares to cross this line, Richard and Victoria are the best examples to follow." A chorus of tense but unified voices echoed in the conference room. "President Blake, please rest assured, we will strictly implement all the company's core directives." The entire meeting lasted less than 40 minutes. Yet it was extremely efficient, ruthless, and precise. There was no nonsense, no excuses. Every executive displayed 200% execution when facing me. This is the absolute transformation brought about by capital and power, when you stand at the top of the food chain. Those who were once aloof and indifferent to you will use the most humble posture to win your approval. After the meeting, I returned to my top-floor office alone. As the sun set, golden rays bathed Manhattan in its glow, and the Hudson River shimmered in the distance, a breathtaking sight. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, picked up my coffee, and took a sip when my phone suddenly vibrated. It was a short message from an unfamiliar overseas channel. "Mr. Black, the night sky over Wall Street is beautiful, but your era has only just begun." I stared at the screen, a cold, relieved smile playing on my lips. I replied with a message: "Thanks. I won this game decisively." I put down my phone, turned around, put on my custom-made suit jacket, and strode out of the office. The lamplight cast a long shadow of me. Outside the door lay my brand new world. And thank you for listening. Please subscribe, like, share, and comment. Thank you.